Son, everything we do at these parties needs to stay secret. We do this because we are powerful, and I want you to continue my legacy in the future.
Christian Combs is P. Diddy's eldest son, who, like his father, is also being accused of several crimes and was also one of the American rapper's victims. He confesses his omission and says that he himself was often part of the atrocities committed by his father. Growing up as his son shaped my character in a way that I will pay for the rest of my life. And in this video, we have the opportunity to hear his story, where he tells everything he was forced to do and what happened at parties at his house. Before diving into this story that passed from father to son, subscribe to the channel to follow more shocking stories like this, and comment on whether Christian Combs will follow in the same frightening footsteps as his father. His story begins like this.
I grew up in a world of excess. My father was a gigantic figure, a star who shone everywhere he went. For many, he was an icon, an example of success and power, but inside the house there was another side, a reality that few could imagine. This is my story. As a child, the mansion we lived in was like an enchanted castle. Parties took place almost every day, with important people coming and going. I saw artists, business people, and celebrities that I only knew from television. It was impressive, but at the same time, there was something strange about that environment. It wasn't just the shine. It was as if a shadow hung over everything. I remember being in the hallway once and running into a girl who looked lost. She looked my age, maybe younger, and was clearly uncomfortable. I asked if she needed help, but before she could respond, someone called her back to one of the rooms. I was too young to understand what was happening, but that scene stuck with me. My father always had a very strong presence. He was charismatic, someone people admired and feared at the same time. I started to notice that parties weren't just normal get-togethers. Some of the people there seemed not to be fully aware of what was going on around them. My father said that everything was consensual, that people went because they wanted to, but I wasn't so sure. As I grew up, I was introduced to what he called the game. He told me that I needed to understand how the world worked, that those parties were just business. I started to participate more, to observe, to learn the dynamics. At first, I thought it was just about music and fun, but I started seeing things that made me question everything. Some people were treated coldly, as if they were disposable. There were times when the energy of the party changed, becoming awkward and uncomfortable. One night in particular sticks out in my mind. It was a party on a yacht, and my father was in the spotlight as always. I saw a guest who seemed to be trying to move away from a group, but she couldn't. The environment was so controlled by him that no one questioned anything. She looked scared, but no one intervened, and I didn't have the courage to do anything. After that, I started to notice that I was being pulled more and more into that world. My father said that this was how life worked, that his power protected us from everything. He taught me to never show weakness, to always maintain the appearance that everything was under control. But inside, I was confused and lost. Then the accusations began to surface. A woman spoke about what happened that night on the yacht. She said she was put in a no-win situation, something that should never have happened. When I heard that, I felt a knot in my stomach. I knew it was there. I knew I didn't do anything, but what could I have done? He was my father. Today, looking back, I realized how carried away I was. The stories being told about me are hard to hear. Some of them are exaggerated, others are painfully real. But they are all reflections of the environment in which I grew up, an environment that shaped who I am, for better and for worse. My father always said that nothing could touch him, that he was above any consequences. And I believed that for a long time. But now I see that this is not the case. The choices I made or didn't make have consequences, and I need to deal with them. This is my truth. I grew up in a world controlled by him, but I want to believe I can be something different. I want to believe that I can change the narrative, because in the end, it doesn't matter where we come from, it matters who we decide to be. When I think about the parties that took place at my father's house, one thing always comes to mind: how everything seemed carefully planned, but at the same time out of control. It was like being in a play where all the roles were already defined, but you never knew how the next act would unfold. These parties had a special name that my father used. He called them freak-offs. At first, I thought it was just another expression to refer to extravagant and exclusive events. I was young and, to be honest, fascinated by it all. But over time, I began to realize what was really happening. There was a pattern. Guests always arrived who seemed a little out of place. too young for that environment, nervous. My father always had the ability to make everyone feel at ease, but as the night went on, the energy changed. Drinks were served, loud music played, and the lights made the spaces darker. One thing I remember clearly was how my father insisted on recording everything. He said it was to keep the moments, but today I understand that it wasn't that. He always had a need for control to document every detail of what happened. There were cameras everywhere, some hidden, some visible. Everything was being recorded and everyone was being watched. One time he called me to help him set up one of these devices. I thought it was just to capture moments from the parties, but I realized that the focus was always on very specific situations, on the guests he considered most interesting. When I asked why, he laughed and said, "It's always good to have something saved. You never know when you might need it." At the time, I didn't understand the weight of those words, but now it haunts me. Some of these recordings have begun to be mentioned in recent lawsuits and investigations. They called it freak-off tapes. I don't know exactly what they show, but if they are what I imagine, they are evidence that could destroy lives, both those of the victims and those who participated knowingly or unknowingly. I've also heard rumors that some of these tapes were turned over to authorities by people who worked for him in the past. I know they contain much more than extravagant parties. What was being recorded there was not to entertain, it was to intimidate, to ensure that no one spoke, to protect my father from any threat. There was always a power play. I saw people who seemed to be having fun, but the next day they avoided looking into his eyes. Some of them never came back. My father said that this was normal, that people couldn't handle the pace, but deep down I knew there was something more. Today, this evidence is the key to understanding what really happened. They are proof of how control was exercised and how many felt trapped in a cycle that seemed impossible to escape. Seeing my name associated with this is like carrying a weight that I never asked for, but that I know I need to face. The truth is, for a long time, I ignored my surroundings. I thought if I didn't look directly, it wouldn't be real. But the cameras were always there, recording everything, including my omission. Now, there's no getting away from it. Being part of a famous family like mine is something that many people imagine to be a dream, but the reality was very different. My father, with all his charisma and power, was always a central figure in our house, but this came with a price. Growing up in this environment affected all of us in ways no one on the outside could imagine. Our family dynamics have always been complicated. My father had a way of keeping everyone in check, of making even our opinions seem less important than his. He was the boss, and we were, in a way, part of the show he was creating. However, behind this facade was an emotional weight that became harder to bear as we grew up. The moment things started to change was when the allegations against him came to light. Suddenly, all the attention was on us. People wanted to know what we thought, whether we would support him or distance ourselves. For me, it was like being pulled into a hurricane. On the one hand, he was my father. On the other, I knew that many of the things he was being accused of were not just rumors. During the hearings, I saw how our family began to fragment. Some of my siblings decided it was best to step away completely, while others still tried to show support. Justin and I were the only ones who attended on a few occasions, but even that felt more like a duty than a choice. We weren't there because we wanted to be, but because we knew that if we weren't, it would be used against us. My stepson, Quincy, was also there at key moments. His relationship with my father has always been something that confused me. My father treated him with an attention that often seemed excessive, almost as if he were trying to mold him in a very specific way. There were times when I even wondered if this was healthy. Some of the things I saw between them made me uncomfortable, but I never had the courage to question them directly. Our mother always tried to be the link that held everyone together, but over time, even she began to distance herself. The parties, the stories, the headlines, it was all too much to bear. She said she did what she could to protect us, but in the end, I don't think even she knew how to deal with everything that was happening. When news broke about the most serious cases, I realized that our family was hopelessly divided. Some of us wanted to believe that he was innocent, that it was all just misunderstandings or exaggerations. Others knew something was very wrong and just wanted to get as far away as possible. I felt caught between these two worlds, trying to decide where my loyalties lay. Now, looking from the outside, I realized how much the impact of this environment affected us. We weren't just an ordinary family. We were pieces of a bigger puzzle, a power game that my father controlled. Today, some of us barely speak to each other, and not because we don't care, but because we are all dealing with our own internal battles. My greatest hope is that somehow we can find a way to rebuild ourselves. I know it won't be easy. but I want to believe that there is still something worth fighting for. Because at the end of the day, we are more than the choices our father made. We are individuals, and each of us deserves the chance to start over. As difficult as it is to share my story, I believe that the voices of the people who were impacted by all of this are even more important. The victims, the people who lived experiences that were often ignored or covered up. Hearing their stories was one of the most challenging moments of my life. One of the stories that impacted me the most was that of a woman who spoke publicly about what happened at one of the parties organized by my father. She described how she was taken into an environment where she had no control, how things quickly became confusing and terrifying. His words were raw and painful, but necessary. She talked about how she tried to resist, but was put in a situation where no one helped her, where all the doors seemed to be closed. Another victim spoke about how she was lured with promises of opportunity, only to be placed in a scenario that seemed more like a nightmare. I remember hearing her describe how disoriented she felt, as if something had been altered in her drink. The pain in his voice was evident, and I couldn't help but think about how many times I've been in that room and not realized what was happening right before my eyes. One thing that was clear from many of these accounts is that people trusted my father. He had a way of making everyone feel safe, special, but for some, it was used against him. It was as if he knew exactly how to manipulate the situation so that no one questioned what was happening. One of the hardest testimonies to hear was from a man who spoke about how he was lured to one of the events with the promise of work. He said he was treated well at first, but as the night went on, he began to feel something was wrong. He described how he lost the ability to react and how that left him in a vulnerable position. He didn't know how to deal with what had happened, and his voice shook as he recounted the experience. I can't imagine what these people went through. What I can say is that while growing up in that environment, there were times when I felt like something was wrong, but I never had the courage to question it. My father was always an authority figure, and his control was almost absolute. The people around us also seemed afraid to speak out, as if no one had the right to challenge the narrative he created. What hurts me most is knowing that many of these people spent years carrying this pain in silence. Some of them said they felt no one would believe them, that an ordinary person's word would never be enough against someone so powerful. Others faced threats and attempts to silence them, which only made it even more difficult for them. Today, when I hear these reports, I feel a huge weight, not only because of pain these people face, but also because of my indirect role in it. It didn't matter if I was young or didn't fully understand what was going on. I was there. I saw things that perhaps I could have prevented, and this guilt is something I will have to live with for the rest of my life. I want these people to know that their voices matter, that their stories deserve to be heard and taken seriously, because at the end of the day, it's only through the truth that we can begin to seek some kind of justice. My father always had a talent for attracting the right people. He knew how to build connections with some of the most powerful and influential figures in the industry. I grew up seeing celebrities come and go in our home, often treating my father as an equal or even as someone above them. But as time went by, I began to realize that these relationships were more complicated than they seemed. Some of the biggest stars in the world attended my father's parties. They showed up to celebrate, to connect, and perhaps to escape their own realities. However, as investigations began to emerge, it became clear that many were present in situations that are now questioned. It's hard to think how people I admired, who many consider heroes, could have been part of something so dark. I don't know how much each of them knew or to what extent they were involved, but I know some were there when things that shouldn't happen happened. I've heard rumors about recordings that show delicate moments with well-known figures. It made me question everything. Did they know they were being recorded? Did they participate because they wanted to, or were they manipulated? I don't have all the answers, but these questions stay with me. I remember one party in particular where some of the most respected names in music and entertainment were in attendance. They laughed, talked, and acted as if everything was normal. But I wonder, did none of them notice what was going on in the background? Did no one see the same signs that I saw? Or have they, like me, simply chosen to ignore it? Over time, some of these names began to distance themselves from my father. It was almost as if they knew something was about to explode. However, their silence also speaks volumes. None of them spoke out to defend him, but they also did nothing to condemn him. They remained quiet, protecting their own reputations, while others faced the consequences. I know there are people who are afraid of what may come. Some of them may have been just spectators, others may have been more deeply involved than they want to admit. But what makes me most uncomfortable is thinking that, on one level or another, everyone knew something was wrong. Today, As I watch these familiar faces on screens and listen to their music, I can't help but feel a disconnect. They are part of a memory that now seems distant, almost unreal. And yet I know they were there. I know that in some way they contributed to this narrative. I'm not here to point fingers or accuse without proof, but I believe that if these people truly cared about justice, they would speak out. They would share what they know, help bring the truth to light, because in the end, their silence not only protects themselves, it also perpetuates the cycle of pain that so many people have faced. I hope that one day these figures find the courage to do the right thing, because while they remain silent, the truth remains trapped in the shadows. When the allegations against my father first surfaced, it seemed like something that could be resolved quickly, like so many other controversies he had faced. However, this time, it was different. The details were very serious and evidence began to emerge from ways that could no longer be ignored. That's when I realized it wasn't just about him, it was about all of us. The first report spoke of parties and situations that seemed distant, almost unbelievable. But as more victims began sharing their stories, the gravity of what was being said became clear. My father faced accusations of manipulating situations to gain complete control over those around him. What once appeared to be a power play in the social environment was now being analyzed in a much darker light. The lawsuits began to pile up. Each one seemed more detailed and with more evidence than the last. There were reports of specific moments, dates, and locations, and even recordings that supposedly corroborated the stories. As someone who grew up in that environment, I began to realize how much of what was being said was plausible. Even though I hadn't seen everything, I knew enough to understand that many of these stories had a grain of truth. Some people tried to protect my father, but even they were being pulled into the center of the investigation. Employees, close friends, and even members of our family were mentioned as accomplices or enablers. I myself was named in some complaints, something that made me question all my choices up to that point. Could I have done something different? Was my omission also a form of guilt? The authorities began to act more intensely. My father's name appeared in accusations that ranged from manipulation to involvement in an organized scheme to exploit others. He was taken into custody, and for the first time, the power he had always demonstrated seemed to be fading. The people who used to protect him began to move away, and his isolation became evident. One of the hardest things to see was how these accusations impacted our family. It wasn't just about him, it was about all of us. My last name carried a weight I didn't know if I could bear. I often wondered if I should change my name, start over somewhere where no one knew me, but at the same time I knew that would be running away. Today my father faces a list of charges that are still being evaluated. Some of it seems almost impossible to believe, but the evidence keeps coming. He always said that nothing could touch him, that he was above the rules. But now I see that the truth has a way of surfacing even when you try to bury it. For me, the hardest lesson was realizing that actions have consequences even when you think you are protected. What happened to my father is a reminder that no one is above justice. And while this doesn't erase the pain that so many people have faced, it is a step in the right direction. There is still a lot to be resolved. Investigations continue and new stories appear almost every day. But I hope that, in some way, this process brings some peace to those who have suffered. Because in the end, justice is not just about punishing the guilty. It's also about giving victims the chance to be heard and recognized. The house I grew up in always looked like something out of a dream to outsiders. Big parties, influential people, an environment that exuded power and status. But over the years, I realized that that house was more than just a place where we lived. It was also the setting for many things that are now being revealed to the world. My father was always meticulous. He liked to control everything, and that included what happened at our parties. From an early age, I knew there were cameras everywhere. At the time, I thought it was just for security, to make sure no one broke in or caused problems. But over time, I understood that these cameras had another purpose. The recordings, which are now being called freak-off tapes, were like a visual diary of the parties. My father said they were for souvenirs, but the places they were positioned told a different story. There were rooms, discreet corridors, private areas, places where delicate moments could be captured. I don't know how many of these recordings actually exist or what they show, but I know that some of them are already in the hands of authorities. When I found out about this, I felt a mixture of relief and fear. Relief because finally, part of the truth could come to light. Scared because I knew these recordings could include familiar faces, people I respected, and perhaps even me. The evidence is not limited to videos. There are messages, witness accounts, medical records, and even financial documents that link some of my father's actions to a broader scheme. I remember overhearing conversations where he always seemed one step ahead, planning his every move to ensure no one could stand up to him. He had a way of making everyone around him dependent on him, whether emotionally or financially. One of the things that surprised me the most was learning that former employees started sharing what they knew. Some of these people were present at many of the parties and events. They were the first to notice the pattern, to notice that something was wrong. I know they were probably silent out of fear, but now their voices are helping to connect the pieces. The impact of this evidence is enormous. They not only confirm the victims' accounts, but also show how carefully everything was orchestrated. It wasn't random or impulsive. It was a system, a cycle that my father created and maintained for years. Growing up, I always knew he was smart, that he had a unique way of running things. But I never imagined that this intelligence would be used in such a calculating way. Looking back, I see the signs I ignored. I see the moments when I could have asked, challenged, or even tried to better understand what was happening. Today, this evidence is a centerpiece of what is happening in the courts. They are bringing to light what many have tried to hide for so long. And although it is difficult for me to know that my family is at the center of all of this, I know that this evidence is essential for the truth to be known. I hope that in the future, this evidence will not only be used to hold those responsible accountable, but also to protect others from going through the same thing. Because in the end, justice is not just about the past. It's about building a future where things like this can't happen anymore. If there's one thing my father always knew how to do well, it was controlling the people around him. He had an almost hypnotic way of convincing people to do what he wanted, of keeping them in his orbit, even when they knew that something was wrong. Growing up alongside him, I was trained to believe that this was just leadership. Today, I realize it was something much darker. Since I was little, my father taught me that power wasn't just about money or fame, but about how you made people depend on you. He always said, if they need you, they will never abandon you. And indeed, he built an empire where everyone around him seemed unable to free themselves from his influence. I've seen this happen to friends, employees, and even our own family. He knew exactly what to say to make people feel like they had no choice but to follow him. Sometimes this came in the form of generosity, expensive gifts, favors, career opportunities. Other times it was through fear and intimidation. One of the most disturbing tactics he used was to collect information about everyone around him. He kept records of conversations, recordings, and even private messages. I remember hearing him say once, "Everyone has a secret. The trick is to know which it is." At the time, I didn't understand the weight of these words. Today, I see how he used this to ensure that no one dared challenge him. I heard stories of people who tried to walk away from him and faced immediate consequences. Some lost jobs, others had personal secrets exposed. I saw up close how he could turn the tables on someone in an instant, turning allies into enemies and vice versa. This pattern of control also extended to victims. He made them feel isolated, like no one would believe them. He would say things like, "Do you think anyone will believe you over me?" It was a psychological game, and he was a master at it. Many of the recent accusations show how methodically these control tactics were used. Parties were not just social events. They were designed to put people in situations where he could exert his power over them. The drinks, the lights, the music, everything was calculated to create an environment where people let their guard down. One of the stories that impacted me the most was that of an employee who worked with us for years. She always seemed dedicated and loyal, but years later I learned that she lived in constant fear. She said that my father made her feel that her career and even her safety depended on doing exactly what he wanted. It was this type of manipulation that he used to maintain absolute control over everyone around him. Even I, as a son, was not exempt from this. He knew how to play on my fears and insecurities, how to make me feel like my loyalty to him was more important than anything else. There were times when I wanted to question him, but there was always that voice in my head saying, what if he's right? What if you really can't survive without it? Today, I see how much this control affected so many lives. It wasn't just the people he directly manipulated, but also those who stayed silent because they were afraid of what he might do. It was a cycle that seemed impossible to break. However, now that all of this has come to light, I hope people can begin to free themselves from this influence. I hope that by exposing these stories, we can help others understand that they don't have to live under this kind of control, because no one should have that much power over another person.